Where are you hiding, rogue? Where are you? Perhaps you are watching me to see if I lose my mind, but I will see you lose yours, scoundrel. He pushed the animal onto the deck with the butt of his musket and, overcoming his revulsion, picked it up with his bare hands and flung it into the sea. Determined to discover the hiding place of the intruder, he went back to the woodpile, taking care not to roll again on the logs now scattered over the floor. Beyond the wood he found a place that on the Amaryllis they called the soda, or sood or soda, for storing biscuit. Under a canvas there, carefully wrapped and protected, he found first of all a very large spyglass, more powerful than the one he had in his room, perhaps a hyperbole of the eyes intended for the exploration of the sky. The telescope was in a big basin of light metal, and beside the basin, also carefully wrapped, were instruments of uncertain nature, metallic arms, a circular cloth with rings along its circumference, a kind of helmet, and finally 3 rounded containers that, to his smell, seemed full of a thick, stagnant oil. What purpose this collection might serve, Roberto did not ask himself. At that moment what he sought was a living creature. He examined the soda to see if, below it, yet another space opened. There was one, but it was very cramped, so that he could advance only on all fours. He explored it, holding the lamp low, watching out for scorpions and in fear of setting fire to the ceiling. After a brief crawl he reached the end, striking his head against hard larch, the Ultima Thule of the Daphne, beyond which he could hear the water slapping against the hull. So beyond that blind passage there could be nothing further. Then he stopped, as if the Daphne could reveal no more secrets to him. If it seems strange that during a week or more on board the ship Roberto had not succeeded in seeing everything, suffice it to recall what happens to a boy who climbs into the attics or the cellars of a great and ancient dwelling, irregular in its plan. At every step cases of old books appear, discarded clothing, empty bottles, and piles of fagos, ruined furniture, dusty and rickety cupboards. The boy advances, lingers on the discovery of some treasure, glimpses an entrance, a dark passage, and imagines some alarming presence there, postpones the search to a later occasion, and he proceeds always in tiny steps, on the one hand fearing to go too far, on the other in anticipation of future discoveries, yet daunted by the emotion of the recent ones, and that attic or cellar never ends, and can have in store for him enough new nooks and crannies to last through his boyhood and beyond. And if the boy is frightened every time by new noises, or if, to keep him away from those labyrinths, he is daily told terrifying tales, and if that boy, in addition, is drunk, obviously the space will expand at each new adventure. Such was Roberto's life in the exploration of his still hostile territory. It was early morning, and Roberto again was dreaming. He dreamed of Holland. It was while the cardinal's men were conducting him to Amsterdam to put him on the Amaryllis. During the journey they stopped at a city, and he entered the cathedral. He was impressed by the cleanliness of the naves, so different from those of Italian and French churches. Bare of decorations, only a few standards hanging from the naked columns, the glass windows plain and without images. The sun created there a milky atmosphere dotted only by the few black forms of the worshippers below. In that piece a single sound was heard, a sad melody that seemed to wander through the ivory air, borne from the capitals or the keystones. Then he noticed in one chapel, in the ambulatory of the choir, a man in black, alone in one corner playing a little recorder, his eyes staring into the void. When the musician finished, Roberto went over to him, wondering if he should give him something. Not looking into Roberto's face, the man thanked him for his praise, and Roberto realized he was blind. He was the master of the bells, der Musician en Directeur van de Klokwerken, Le Carillonneur, der Glockenspieler, he tried to explain, but it was also part of his job to delight with the sound of his flute the faithful who lingered at evening in the yard and the cemetery beside the church. He knew many melodies, and on each he developed 2, 3, sometimes even 5 variations of increasing complexity, nor was it necessary for him to read notes. Born blind, he could move in that handsome luminous space, yes, he said luminous, of his church, seeing, as he said, the sun with his skin. He explained how his instrument was so much a living thing, that it reacted to the seasons, and to the temperature of morning and sunset, but in the church there was always a sort of diffuse warmth that guaranteed the wood a steady perfection, and Roberto reflected on the notion of diffuse warmth a man of the north might have, for he himself was growing cold in this clarity. The musician played for him the first melody twice more, and said it was entitled, Dune Daphne de Verschoon Mate. He refused any offering, touched Roberto's face and said, or at least Roberto understood him to say, that Daphne was something sweet, which would accompany Roberto all of his life. Now, on the Daphne, Roberto opened his eyes and, without doubt, heard coming from below, through the fissures in the wood, the notes of Daphne, as if it were being played by a more metallic instrument which, not hazarding variations, repeated at regular intervals the first phrase of the tune, like a stubborn ritornello. He told himself at once that it was a most ingenious emblem, to be on a flute named Daphne and to hear music for flute entitled Daphne. It was pointless to persist in the illusion that this was a dream. It was a new message from the intruder. Once again he armed himself, once again he sought strength from the keg, then followed the sound. It seemed to originate in the clockroom. But, since he had scattered those mechanisms over the deck, the space was now empty. He revisited it, still empty, but the music was coming from its far wall. Surprised the first time by the clocks themselves, breathless the second time from the effort of carrying them off, he had never considered whether or not the room ran all the way to the hull. If so, the far wall should have been curved. But was it? The great canvas with that perspective of clocks created a deception of the eye, so at first sight there was no telling if the wall was flat or concave. Roberto started to rip away the canvas, but he realized it was a running curtain, as in a theater. And behind the curtain there was another door, also closed with a chain and lock. With the courage of the devotees of Bacchus, and as if with a spingarde shot he could overpower all enemies, he aimed his gun, shouted in a loud voice, and God only knows why, Nevers at Saint Denis, gave the door a kick, and flung himself forward, intrepid. The object occupying the space was an organ, which was surmounted by about 20 pipes, from whose holes the notes of the melody issued. The organ was fixed to the wall and consisted of a wooden structure supported by an armature of little metal columns. On the upper level, the pipes were in the center, but at either side of them little automata moved. To the left, on a kind of circular base, stood an anvil certainly hollow inside, like a bell. Around the base were 4 figures that moved their arms rhythmically, striking the anvil with little metal hammers. The hammers, of varying weight, produced silvery sounds in harmony with the tunes sung by the pipes, commenting on it through a series of chords. Roberto recalled conversations in Paris with a Minim friar, who spoke to him of research into the universal harmony. Thanks more to their musical functions than to their features, he now recognized Vulcan and the 3 Cyclops to whom, as legend had it, Pythagoras referred when he affirmed that the difference in musical intervals depended on number, weight, and measure. To the right of the pipes an Amerino tapped out, striking a wand upon a wooden book held in his other hand, the ternary rhythm on which the melody, Daphne, was based. On a slightly lower level lay the console of the organ, its keys rising and falling according to the notes emitted by the pipes, as if an invisible hand were running over them. Below the keys, where as a rule the organist works the bellows with his feet, a cylinder had been set, in which teeth were fitted, large spikes, in an order unpredictably regular or regularly unpredictable, which suggested the way notes are arranged in rising and descending patterns, unforeseen breaks, vast white spaces and a density of crotchets, on the lines of a sheet of music. Below the cylinder was a fixed horizontal bar supporting some little levers which, as the cylinder turned, successively touched the teeth and, through a play of half-hidden rods, operated the keys, as they operated the pipes. But the most stupefying phenomenon was the reason why the cylinder rotated and the pipes received breath. To the side of the organ a glass siphon was fixed, whose form recalled the cocoon of a silkworm, inside which 2 perforated plates could be discerned, one above the other, dividing it into 3 separate chambers. The siphon received an influx of water from a pipe entering its lowest chamber from an open gun port that also admitted light to this room, pouring in the liquid that through the action of some hidden pump was obviously sucked directly from the sea, but in such a way that, entering the cocoon, it was mixed with air. The water entered the lowest part of the cocoon with force, as if it were boiling. Spun in a vortex against the walls, it no doubt released the air, which was inhaled through the 2 plates. Thanks to a tube linking the upper part of the cocoon with the base of the organ pipes, the air was transformed into song through artful movements. The water, which meanwhile had gathered in the lower part, ran off through another tube and, moving the wheel of a little mill, then poured into a metal shell below, whence it was emptied, by another pipe, through the gun port. The wheel turned a bar that, connected to the cylinder, transmitted its own movement. To the drunken Roberto all this seemed natural, so natural that he felt betrayed when the cylinder began to slow down, and the pipes whistled their tune as if it was dying in their throat, while the Cyclops and the Amerino relaxed their blows. Obviously, though in his day there was much talk of perpetual motion, the hidden pump that controlled the intake and flow of the water could operate only for a certain amount of time after being set in motion, and then its impetus came to an end. Roberto did not know whether to be amazed more by this feat of technasma, and he had heard talk of other similar feats, the making of little skeletons or winged cherubs dance, or more by the fact that the intruder, since it could be none but he, had made the organ play on that morning and at that hour. And to send what message? That Roberto the beginning? That the Daphne could still conceal such and so many surprises, that he could spend his life trying to violate her, in vain. A philosopher once told him that God knows the world better than we do because he made it. And that to approach divine knowledge, even slightly, it was necessary to conceive the world as a great building and try to construct it. This is what he had to do. To know the Daphne, he had to construct her. He sat down at his table then and traced the outline of the ship, relying both on the remembered structure of the Amaryllis and on what he had seen so far of the Daphne. So, then, he said to himself, we have the cabins of the quarterdeck and, below, the guardroom. Even further below, but still at the level of the deck, the gunroom and the space where the tiller passes. It has to emerge at the stern, and there can be nothing more than that. All this is on the same level with the cookroom in the forecastle. After that, the bowsprit rests on another elevation, and there, if I am correctly interpreting Roberto's awkward paraphrases, is the place where, with buttocks exposed, bodily functions were performed at that time. If you went down below the cookroom, you arrived at the stores. He had explored to the end of the bowsprit, and here, too, there could be nothing else. Below he had found the hawsers and the fossil collection. There was no going beyond that. So he retraced his steps and crossed the whole lower deck, through the aviary and the greenhouse. Unless the intruder could transform himself at will into animal or vegetable, he could not hide there. Beneath the tiller were the organ and the clocks. There, too, Roberto had gone all the way to the hull. Descending still farther, he had found the broadest part of the hold, with additional provisions, ballast, wood, and he had knocked against the side to make sure there was no false wall that would give off a hollow sound. If this was a normal ship, the bilge would not allow other refuges. Unless the intruder himself clung to the keel, underwater, like a leech, and crawled aboard at night. But of all the explanations, and he was prepared to consider many, this seemed to Roberto the least scientific. Aft, more or less beneath the organ, there was the soda with the basin, the telescope, and the other instruments. Looking around it, he had not investigated to see if the space ended right at the helm, but from the drawing he was now making, it seemed to him that the paper did not allow him to imagine any other void, if he had drawn the curve of the stern correctly. Below, only the blind passage was left, and after that there was nothing, he was sure. So, dividing the ship into compartments, he had filled it all and left no space for any other storage. Conclusion. The intruder did not have a fixed place. He moved as Roberto moved. He was like the far side of the moon, which we know must exist though we never see it. Who could see the other face of the moon? Only an inhabitant of the fixed stars. He could wait, not moving, and he would catch the concealed face by surprise. As long as Roberto moved with the intruder or allowed the intruder to base his movements on Roberto's, Roberto would never see him. He had to become a fixed star and force the intruder to move. And as the intruder obviously was on deck when Roberto was below, and vice versa, he had to make the intruder believe him below in order to surprise him on deck. To mislead the intruder, Roberto left a light burning in the captain's quarters, as if he were there, engaged in writing. Then he went and hid at the top of the forecastle, just behind the bell, so that, turning, he could survey the area below the bowsprit, while before him he dominated the deck and the after castle all the way to the lantern of the poop. He set his musket beside him, and, I fear, also a keg of aqua vitae. He spent the night alert to any sound, as if he were still spying on Dr. Bird, pinching his ears to stay awake until dawn. In vain. Then he went back to his berth, where meanwhile the light had gone out, and found his papers in disorder. The intruder had spent the night there, perhaps reading the letters to the lady, while Roberto was suffering the chill of the night and the morning's dew. The adversary had now penetrated his memories. Roberto recalled Salazar's warning. Expressing his private passions had opened a breach in his spirit. He rushed out on deck and fired a bullet at random, splintering a mast, then he shot again, until he realized that he was killing no one. Considering the time it took in those days to reload a musket, the enemy could take a stroll between shots, having a good laugh at that rumpus, which had impressed only the animals, clucking below. The intruder was laughing, then. But where was he laughing? Roberto went back to his drawing and told himself that he truly knew nothing about shipbuilding. The drawing showed only top, bottom, and length, not breadth. Seen in its length, we would now say, in cross-section, the ship revealed no other possible hiding places, but seen in its breadth, other places could be lurking among those already discovered. Roberto, pondering, realized only now that on this ship too many things were still missing. For example, he had found no other weapons. Very well. Assume that the sailors had taken them away, if they had abandoned the ship of their own volition. But on the Amaryllis the hold had been crammed also with considerable lumber, for repairing masts, the helm, the sides, in the event of damage by the elements, whereas here he had found only enough firewood, recently dried, to supply the cook stove, but nothing of oak or larch or seasoned fir. Also wanting, along with carpenter's wood, were carpenter's tools. Saws, axes of various sizes, hammers, nails. Were there other storerooms? He drew the design over again, and tried to portray the ship not seen from a side but as if observed from the crow's nest. And he decided that in this beehive he was drawing there could still be inserted a nook beneath the organ, from which it was possible to descend farther, without a ladder, into the blind passage. Not big enough to contain everything that was missing, but an extra hole in any case. If in the low ceiling of the blind passage there existed a trap through which to hoist oneself into that same newly conceived space, from there anyone could climb up to the clocks and then have the run of the entire vessel. Now Roberto was sure that the enemy could be only there. He hurried below, slipped into the passage, this time throwing light on its ceiling. And there was a trapdoor. He resisted the initial impulse to open it. If the intruder was up there, he would wait for Roberto to stick his head through the opening, then overpower him. The intruder had to be taken by surprise from the direction where he was not expecting an attack, as they had done at Casali. If there was a chamber above, it was adjacent to that of the telescope, and Roberto could enter there. He went up, passing through the soda, stepping over the instruments, to find himself at a wall that, only now did he realize it, was not of the same hard wood as the hull. This wall was fairly thin. As before, on entering the place from which the music came, he gave a sturdy kick and the wood splintered. He was in the dim light of a rat's nest, with a little porthole in the rounded far wall. And there on a pallet, his knees almost against his chin, his outstretched arm clutching a big pistol, was the other. He was an old man, his pupils dilated, his desiccated face framed by a pepper and salt beard, his sparse white hair standing up on his head, his mouth almost toothless, the gums the color of blueberries. He was engulfed in some cloth that once might have been black but now was greasy with pale stains. Pointing the pistol, which he gripped in both hands as his arms trembled, he shouted in a weak voice. The first sentence was in German or Dutch, and the second, and surely he was repeating his message, was in halting Italian, a sign that he had deduced his interlocutor's nationality by looking at his papers. If you move, I kill you. Roberto was so surprised by the apparition that his reaction was slow. And just as well, for he had time to realize that the pistol was not cocked, and the enemy therefore was not much versed in the military arts. So he went over amiably, grasped the pistol by the barrel, and tried to slip it from those hands clenched around the butt, while the creature emitted wrathful Germanic cries. With some effort Roberto finally managed to wrest the weapon from him. The man sank down, and Roberto knelt beside him, supporting the old man's head. Sir, he said, I mean you no harm. I am a friend. You understand? Amicus. The man opened and closed his mouth, but could not speak. Only the white of his eyes could be seen, or, rather, the red, and Roberto feared he was on the point of death. He took the man in his arms, frail as he was, and carried him to his room. He offered him water, made him sip some aqua vitae, and the man said, Gratias ago, Domini, raised his hand as if to bless Roberto, who at that point, taking a closer look at the man's dress, realized he was a cleric. Chapter 21. Telluris Theoria Sacra. We will not reconstruct the dialogue that followed over the next 2 days. For that matter, Roberto's papers become more laconic from now on. His confidences to the lady having perhaps fallen under alien eyes, he never had the courage to seek confirmation from his new companion. He stops writing altogether for many days, then records in a far more curt style what he learns and what happens. So Roberto found himself facing Father Caspar Wanderdrossel, e Societate. Iesu. Olim in Herbopolitano Franconia Gymnasio, Postia in Collegio Romano Mathesios professor, and, further, astronomer, and student of many other disciplines, at the General Curia of the Order. The Daphne, under a Dutch captain who had already ventured along those routes for the Verenigde Oost-Indisch Company, had left the Mediterranean shores many months earlier, circumnavigating Africa with the aim of arriving at the Islands of Solomon. Precisely as Dr. Bird had proposed to do on the Amaryllis, except that the Amaryllis sought the islands by sailing west to reach the east, whereas the Daphne had done the opposite, but it matters little, the Antipodes can be reached from either direction. On the island, and Father Ioria Oacra Caspar motioned beyond the beach, beyond the trees, the Specula Melitensis was to be mounted. The nature of this Maltese mirror was not clear, and Father Caspar, mentioning it, lowered his voice as if referring to a secret so famous that it was on the lips of the entire world. To arrive here, the Daphne had taken its own good time. Everyone knows what it meant to navigate those seas in that period. After leaving the Moluccas, bound southeast for Porto Sancti Tome in New Guinea, as it was necessary to call at the places where the Society of Jesus had its missions, the ship, driven by a storm, became lost in waters never before seen, arriving at an island inhabited by rats as big as boys, with very long tails and bags over their abdomen. Roberto had encountered a stuffed exemplar. Indeed, Father Caspar reproached him for throwing away a wonder worth all Peru. They were, Father Caspar told him, friendly animals, who surrounded the seamen, holding out their little hands to beg for food, or actually tugging at the men's clothes, but in the end they proved to be expert thieves and even stole hardtack from one sailor's pocket. If I may be allowed to interject, to support Father Caspar's credibility, let me confirm that such an island exists, and cannot be mistaken for any other. Those pseudo-kangaroos are called quokkas, and they live only there, on Rottnest Island, which the Dutch had then only recently discovered, calling it in fact the island of rats' nests. But as the island is off Perth, the Daphne must have reached the western coast of Australia. If we consider that she was therefore on the 30th parallel south and west of the Moluccas, whereas she was supposed to have gone east, just a bit below the equator, we would be obliged to say that the Daphne was off course. But that was the least of it. The men of the Daphne must have seen a coast not far from that island, and they probably thought it was some other little island with some other rodent on it. They were in search of something quite different, and who knows what Father Caspar's instruments were saying on board. Surely, the seamen were only a few oar strokes from that terra incognita at Australis that mankind had been dreaming of for centuries. What is hard to conceive, since the Daphne would finally reach, as we shall see, a latitude of 17 degrees south, is how they managed to circumnavigate at least half of Australia without ever seeing it. Either they sailed north and then passed between Australia and New Guinea, risking at every mile running aground on either one shore or the other, or else they sailed south, passing between Australia and New Zealand, seeing always open sea. You would think I was narrating a romance, if Abel Tasman, setting out from Batavia more or less during the months of our story, had not also arrived at a land that he called Van Diemen, which today we know as Tasmania, but since he, too, was seeking the Solomon Islands, he kept the southern shore of that land on his left, never imagining that beyond it lay a continent 100 times greater, and he ended up southeast of New Zealand, flanked it to the northeast and, abandoning it, reached the Tongas. Thus he arrived by and large where the Daphne was, I believe, but there, too, he passed between the coral reefs and headed for New Guinea. Which meant caroming like a billiard ball, but it seems that for many years afterwards navigators were fated to arrive within a hair's breadth of Australia and not see it. So we can accept Father Caspar's story as authentic. Often following the whims of the trades, the Daphne ended up in storm after storm and would be badly mauled, so they would have to stop at some god-forsaken island without trees, just sand forming a ring around a little central lake. There they would patch up the ship, and this explained why there was no longer a supply of carpenter's wood on board. Then they resumed navigating, and finally came to cast anchor in this bay. The captain sent a boat ashore with an advance guard, decided there were no inhabitants, but, just in case, he loaded and aimed his few cannon. Then 3 operations, all fundamental, were set in motion. First, the collection of water and provisions, which were by then almost exhausted. Second, the capture of animals and uprooting of plants to take home to delight the naturalists of the society. Third, the felling of trees to provide a new supply of logs and planks, material against future misfortunes. The final operation was the installation, on a height of the island, of the Specula Melitensis, and this proved the most laborious undertaking. From the hold they had to collect all the carpenter's tools and the various pieces of the specula, then carry them ashore. All this consumed much time, particularly because they could not unload directly in the bay. Between the ship and the shore, almost at the surface of the water and with only two narrow gaps, there extended a barbican, a curtain wall, a terraplane, and a wall made entirely of coral, in short, what today would be called a coral reef. After many unfruitful attempts they discovered that they would have to round the cape to the south of the bay each time. Beyond it there was an inlet that allowed them to land. And that is why that boat abandoned by the sailors we cannot see nunc, although it is still behind there, Heu Miserum. As can be deduced from Roberto's transcription, this Teuton had lived in Rome, speaking Latin with his brothers from 100 countries, but he had had little practice in Italian. When the specula had been set up, Father Casper began making his observations, which proceeded successfully for almost 2 months. What was the crew doing meanwhile? They were idling, and discipline on board was breaking down. The captain had taken on many kegs of aqua vitae, which were supposed to be used only as a restorative during storms, and then with great parsimony, or else to serve for barter with the natives. But instead, flouting all orders, the crew started bringing the kegs up on deck, and everyone drank to excess, including the captain. Father Casper was working, the others were living like brutes, and from the specula he could hear their lewd singing. One day Father Casper was working alone at the specula. It was very hot, so he removed his cassock. Thus, the good Jesuit said with shame, sinning against modesty, which God could now forgive since he had punished him promptly, and an insect stung him on the chest. At first he felt only a little jab, but when he was ferried back on board that evening, he was attacked by a high fever. He told no one of what had happened to him. Then in the night his ears rang and his head was heavy, so the captain unbuttoned the cassock, and what did he see? A pustule, such as wasps can cause, or even mosquitoes of great dimensions. But immediately that swelling became in the officer's eyes a carbunculus, an anthrax, a nigricant pimple, in short, a bubo, a most evident symptom of the pestis, quae dissiter bubonica, as was immediately noted in the log. Panic spread through the ship. It was futile for Father Casper to tell about the insect. Plague victims always lied so as not to be segregated, this was well known. Futile for him to assure them that he knew the plague well, and this was not plague for many reasons. The crew was almost ready to cast him overboard, to avert contagion. Father Casper tried to explain that during the great pestilence that struck Milan in northern Italy a dozen years before, he had been sent, with some of his brothers, to lend a hand in the lazarettos and to study the phenomenon closely. And therefore he knew a great deal about that contagious luz. There are diseases that affect only individuals and in different places and times, like the Sutor anglicus, others peculiar to a sole region, like the dysenteria melitensis or the elephantiasis aegyptia, and still others that, like the plague, strike over a long period all the inhabitants of many regions. Now, the plague is announced by sunspots, eclipses, comets, the appearance of subterranean animals emerging from their lairs, plants that wither because of mephitis. And none of these signs had appeared on board or on land, or in the sky or on the sea. Secondly, the plague is certainly produced by fetid air that rises from swamps, from the decomposition of many cadavers during war, also by invasions of locusts that drown in swarms in the sea and are then washed up on shore. Contagion is caused, in fact, by those exhalations, which enter the mouth and the lungs, and through the vena cava reach the heart. But in the course of navigation, apart from the stink of the food and the water, which in any case causes scurvy and not plague, the sailors had suffered no malefic exhalation, indeed they had breathed pure air and the most healthful winds. The captain argued that traces of such exhalations stick to clothing and to many other objects, and perhaps on board there was something that had retained the contagion at length and then transmitted it. And he remembered the story of the books. Father Casper had brought with him some good books on navigation, such as L'Arte de Navigar of Medina, the Typhus Batavus of Snellius, and the De Rebus Oceanicus et Orb Novo Decades Trace of Peter Martyr, and one day he told the captain he had acquired them for a trifle, and in Milan. After the plague, on the walls along the canals, the entire library of a gentleman prematurely deceased had been put out for sale. And this was the Jesuit's little private collection, which he carried with him even at sea. For the captain it was obvious that the books, having belonged to a plague victim, were agents of infection. The plague is transmitted, as everyone knows, through veninific unguents, and he had read of people who died by wetting a finger with saliva as they leafed through works whose pages had in fact been smeared with a poison. Father Casper employed all his powers of persuasion, No, in Milan he had studied the blood of the diseased with a very new invention, a technasma that was called an oculino or microscope, and in that blood he had seen some vermiculi floating, and they are precisely the elements of that contagium animatum and are generated by vis naturalis from all rot and then are transmitted, propagators exigui, through the sudoriferous pores or the mouth, or sometimes even the ear. But this pullulation is a living thing, and needs blood for nourishment. It cannot survive 12 or more years amid the dead fibers of paper. The captain would not listen to reason, and the small but lovely library of Father Casper had finally been carried off on the tide. But that was not all. Though Father Casper was quick to say that the plague could be transmitted by dogs and flies but, to his knowledge, surely not by rats, the entire crew nevertheless fell to hunting rats, shooting in every direction, risking breaches in the hold. And finally, as Father Casper's fever continued the next day, and his bubo showed no sign of going away, the captain came to a decision. They would all go to the island and there wait until the priest either died or was healed, and the ship would be purified of every malignant flux and influx. No sooner said than done. Everyone on the ship boarded the longboat laden with weapons and tools. And since it was foreseen that between the priest's death and the time when the ship would be purified 2 or 3 months might have to pass, they had decided to build huts on land, and everything that could make the Daphne a manufactory was towed to shore. Not to mention most of the butts of aquavitae. However, they did not do a good thing, Casper remarked bitterly, grieved by the punishment that heaven had wreaked on them for having abandoned him like a lost soul. For no sooner had they arrived than they promptly went and killed some animals in the woods, then lighted great fires that evening on the beach, and caroused for 3 days and 3 nights. Probably the fires attracted the attention of the savages. Even if the island itself was uninhabited, in that archipelago there lived men black as Africans, who must have been good navigators. One morning Father Casper saw about 10 pirogues arrive from nowhere, beyond the great island to the west, heading for the bay. They were boats hollowed from logs like those of the Indians of the New World, but double. One contained the crew and the other glided over the water like a sled. Father Casper first feared they would make for the Daphne, but they seemed to want to avoid it and instead turned towards the little inlet where the sailors had gone ashore. He tried shouting, to warn the men on the island, but they were in a drunken stupor. In short, the sailors found the savages suddenly upon them, bursting from the trees. The sailors sprang to their feet. The savages immediately displayed their bellicose intentions, but none of the crew could think clearly, still less remember where they had left their weapons. Only the captain stepped forward and felled one of the attackers with a pistol shot. On hearing the report and seeing their comrade fall dead though no other human had touched him, the natives made signs of submission, and one of them approached the captain, holding out a necklace taken from around his own neck. The captain bowed, then was obviously seeking some object to give in exchange, and he turned to ask something of his men. In doing so, he exposed his back to the natives. Father Wanderdrassel thought that the natives, even before the shot, had been immediately awed by the bearing of the captain, a Batavian giant with a blond beard and blue eyes, features that they probably attributed to the gods. But as soon as they saw his back, since it is clear that those savage peoples do not believe a divinity has a back, the native leader, club in hand, promptly attacked him and bashed in his head, and the captain fell prone, moving no more. The black men attacked the sailors, who, unable to defend themselves, were massacred. A horrible banquet ensued, and continued 3 days. Father Casper, in his illness, followed all of it through his spyglass, impotent. The crew became so much butcher's meat. Casper saw the men first stripped, with shrieks of joy, the savages divided clothes and objects, then dismembered, then cooked, and finally chewed with great calm, between gulps of a steaming beverage and some songs that to anyone would have seemed innocent, if they had not accompanied that ghastly kermis. Then the natives, sated, began pointing at the ship. Probably they did not associate it with the presence of the sailors. Majestic as it was with masts and sails, incomparably different from their canoes, they had not thought it the work of man. According to Father Casper, who felt he understood the mentality of idolaters throughout the world, for the Jesuit travelers, returning to Rome, would give accounts of them, they believed it an animal, and the fact that it had remained neutral while they indulged in their anthropophagic rites strengthened this conviction. For that matter even Magellan, Father Casper insisted, had told how certain aborigines believed that ships, having come flying from the sky, were the natural mothers of the longboats, which they nursed allowing them to hang from their sides, then weaned them by flinging them into the air. But now someone probably suggested that if this animal was meek and its flesh as tasty as the sailors, it was worth seizing. And they headed for the Daphne. At which point the peaceful Jesuit, to keep them at a distance, his order imposed that he live ad majorem Dei gloriam and not die for the satisfaction of some pagan cujus deus venter est, lit the fuse of a cannon already loaded, and turned it towards the island, and fired a ball. With a great roar, while the Daphne's flank was haloed with smoke as if the animal were snorting with wrath, the ball fell amid the pirogues, overturning 2 of them. The portent was eloquent. The savages went back to the island, vanishing into the woods, and they emerged a little later with wreaths of flowers and leaves which they cast on the water, making gestures of reverence before they vanished beyond the western island. They had paid what they considered a sufficient tribute to the great irritated animal, and surely they would never be seen again on these shores. They had decided that the area belonged to a peevish and vindictive creature. This was the story of Father Casper Wanderdrassel. For at least a week, before Roberto's arrival, he had felt ill again, but thanks to some preparations of his own making, spiritus, alia, floris, und entierdergleichen vegetabilisch, animalisch, und mineralisch Medikamenten, he had already begun to enjoy his convalescence when one night he heard footsteps on the deck. From that moment, out of fear, he fell ill again, abandoned his room and took refuge in that cubbyhole, taking with him his medicines and a pistol, not knowing whether or not it was loaded. And from there he emerged only to seek food and water. At first he stole the eggs for nourishment, then he confined himself to consuming the fruit. He became convinced that the intruder, in Father Casper's account the intruder was naturally Roberto, was a man of learning, curious about the ship and its contents, and he began to wonder if this man might not be, rather than just a castaway, the agent of some heretical country that wanted the secrets of the Specula Melitensis. This is why the good father had taken to behaving in such a childish fashion, intending to drive Roberto to abandon that vessel infested with demons. Then it was Roberto's turn to tell his story, and not knowing how far Casper had read in his writings, he dwelt in detail on his mission and his voyage on the Amaryllis. The narration took place while, at the end of that first day, they boiled a cock and opened the last of the captain's bottles. Father Casper had to recover his strength and make new blood, and they celebrated what now seemed to each a return to the human community. Ridiculoso, Father Casper commented after hearing the incredible story of Dr. Bird. Such bestialitas have I never heard. Why did they do to him that harm? Of the longitude mysterium I thought to have heard all, but never that it could be sought by using the unguentum armarium. If that was possible, a Jesuit would have invented. This has no connection with longitudes. I will explain you how good I do my work, and you will see it is different. Now tell me, Roberto asked, were you hunting for the islands of Solomon or did you want to solve the mystery of longitudes? Why, both, is it not? You find the islands of Solomon and you have learned where is the 180th meridian. You find the 180th meridian and you know where are the islands of Solomon. But why must those islands lie on that meridian? Ach mein Gott, the Lord forgive I take his most holy name in vain. In Premes, after Solomon the temple had constructed, he made a great fleet, as the Book of Kings says, and this fleet arrives at the island of Ophir, from where they bring him, how do you say, quadragenti und vigenti? 420 talents of gold, a very big richness. The Bible says very little to say very much, as if pars pro toto. And no land near Israel had such big riches, quod significat that the fleet to ultimate edge of the world had gone. Here, but why here? Because here is the meridian 180 which is exact lich the one that divides the earth in two, and on the other side is the first meridian. You count 1, 2, 3, for 360 degrees of meridian, and if you are at 180, here it is midnight and in that first meridian, noon. Verstanden? You guess now why the islands of Solomon are so named? Solomon Dixit. Cut baby in two. Solomon Dixit. Cut earth in two. I understand, if we are on the 180th meridian, we are at the Solomon Islands. But how do you know we are actually on the 180th meridian? Why, the Specula Melitensis, Nictoire. If all my previous evidence is not enough to prove the 180th meridian passes just there, the Specula also proved it. He dragged Roberto onto the deck, pointing to the bay. You see that promontorium north there, where big trees stand with big paws walking on the water? At Hora you see the other promontorium south? You draw a line between the two promontoria, you see the line passes between here and the shore, a bit more apud the shore than apud the ship. See the line, I mean a geistige line that you see with eyes of imagination? Gut, that line is the line of the meridian. The next day Father Casper, who never lost track of time, informed Roberto it was Sunday. He celebrated Mass in his lodging, consecrating a crumb of one of the few hosts he had left. Then he resumed his lesson, first there, among globes and maps, then on deck. When Roberto remonstrated, unable to tolerate the full light of day, the priest from one of his cupboards produced a pair of spectacles, but with smoked lenses, which he had once used to explore profitably the mouth of a volcano. Roberto began to see the world in softer colors, finally very pleasant, and he began gradually to be reconciled to the severity of daylight. To clarify what follows I must provide a gloss, for if I do not, I will not know where I am either. Father Casper was convinced that the Daphne lay between the 16th and 17th degrees of latitude south and at 180 longitude. As far as latitude is concerned, we can trust him completely. But let us imagine he had also got the longitude right. From Roberto's confused notes it seems Father Casper calculates precisely 360 degrees from the Isla de Hierro, 18 degrees west of Greenwich, as tradition had required since the days of Ptolemy. Therefore if he considered that he was at the 180th meridian, it meant that in reality he was at the 162nd east, from Greenwich. Now the Solomons lie comfortably around the 160th east, but from 5 to 12 degrees latitude south. Therefore the Daphne would have been too low, west of the New Hebrides, in a zone where only some coral reefs appear, those that would later become the Recifs d'Entrecasteaux. Could Father Casper have calculated from another meridian? Certainly. As Coronelli, at the end of that century, was to say in his Libro dei Globi, the first meridian was established by Eratosthenes at the Pillars of Hercules, by Martin of Tyre at the Isles of the Blessed, and Ptolemy in his geography accepted the same opinion, but in his books of astronomy he transferred it to Alexandria in Egypt. Among the moderns, Ishmael Abulfeda marks it at Cadiz, Alfonso at Toledo, Pigafetta and Herrera the same, Copernicus sets it at Frumberg, Reinhold at Monte Real or Königsberg, Longomontanus at Copenhagen, Landsbergis at Goes, Riccioli at Bologna, and the atlases of Iansonius and Blow at Monte Pico. To continue the order of my geography in this globe, I have set the prime meridian at the westernmost point of the island of Iron, also to follow the decree of Lewis 13, who with the Council of Geography in 1634 fixed it at that same place. But if Father Casper had decided to ignore the decree of Louis XIII and had established his first meridian, say, at Bologna, then the Daphne would have been anchored more or less between Samoa and Tahiti. The natives there, however, do not have dark skin like those he says he saw. For what reason should the tradition of the Isla de Hierro be accepted? We must start with the assumption that Father Casper speaks of the prime meridian as of a fixed line established by divine decree from the days of the creation. Where would God have considered it natural to have the line run? Through that place of uncertain location, surely Oriental, that was the Garden of Eden? Through Ultima Thule, Jerusalem? No one so far had dared make a theological decision, and rightly. God does not reason as men do. Adam, for example, appeared on the earth after the sun was already there, and the moon, day and night, and hence the meridians. The solution therefore had to be found not in terms of history but, rather, of sacred astronomy. It was necessary to make the dictates of the Bible coincide with what knowledge we had of the celestial laws. Now, according to Genesis, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form, and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. But these waters could not be those we know, which God separates only on the second day, dividing the waters that are above the firmament, from which we still receive rain, from those below, namely rivers and seas. Which means that the first result of creation was first matter, without form or dimensions, qualities, properties, tendencies, lacking movement and repose, raw primordial chaos, Heil, which was yet neither light nor darkness. It was an undigested mass where the four elements were still mingled, as well as cold and hot, dry and wet, churning magma that exploded in glowing drops like a pot of beans, like a diarrheic belly, a clogged pipe, a stagnant pond where circles of water appear and disappear through the immersion and immersion of blind larvae. It was such that the heretics deduced that this matter, so resistant to every creative impulse, was at least as eternal as God. But even so, a divine fiat was necessary if from it and in it and on it the alternating process of light and darkness was to be imposed, day and night. This light, and that day, which is mentioned in the second stage of creation was not yet the light we know, that of the stars and of the two great luminaries, which were not created until the fourth day. This was creative light, divine energy in the pure state, like the ignition of a keg of powder, which at first is black granules compressed into an opaque mass, and then all of a sudden it is an expansion of flames, a concentrate of lightning that spreads to its own extreme confine, beyond which, in contraposition, darkness is created, even if the explosion occurs a day. It is as if from a held breath, from a coal reddening through an inner respiration, from that golden quel de universums was born a scale of luminous excellences gradually descending towards the most irreparable of imperfections, as if the creative afflatus came from the infinite and concentrated luminous power of the divinity, so searing that it seems to us dark night, down through the relative perfection of the cherubim and the seraphim, through the thrones and the dominions, to the lowest waste where the worm crawls and the insensible stone survives at the very border of the void. And this was the Offenbarung Gottlicher Majestat. And if, on the third day, grasses and trees and meadows are already born, it is because the Bible does not yet speak of the landscape that cheers our sight, but of a dark vegetative power, the couplings of seed, the stir of suffering and twisted roots that seek the sun, which, however, on the third day has not yet appeared. Life arrives on the fourth day, when the moon and sun and stars are created to give light to the earth and to separate day from night, as we understand them when we calculate the course of time. It is on this day that the circle of the heavens is arranged, from the primum mobile and the fixed stars to the moon, with the earth in the center, a hard gem barely lighted by the rays of the luminaries, and around it a garland of precious stones. The sun and the moon, establishing our day and our night, were the first and unsurpassed model of all future clocks, which, monkeys of the firmament, mark human time on the zodiac's face, a time that has nothing to do with cosmic time. It has a direction, an anxious respiration composed of yesterday, today, and tomorrow, and not the calm breathing of eternity. We will stop then at this fourth day, Father Casper said. God creates the sun, and when the sun is created, and not before, naturally, it begins to move. Well, at the moment when the sun begins its course never to stop again, in that blitz, in that flash before it takes its first step, it is directly above a precise line that vertically divides the earth in two. And the prime meridian is that on which it is suddenly noon, Roberto commented, believing he had understood everything. Neen, his teacher reproached him. You think God is dumb like you? How can he make the first day of creation at noon begin? Do you perhaps begin, in beginning day hails, the creation with an aborted day, a Liebfrucht, a fetus of a day with only 12 hours? No, certainly not. On the prime meridian the course of the sun would have to begin by the light of the stars, when it was midnight plus a scrap, and before that there was non-time. On that meridian began, at night, the first day of creation. Roberto objected that if on that meridian it was night, an aborted day would have to begin somewhere else, where the sun appeared suddenly, without it or anything else having been before, only dark chaos, without time. Father Casper said that the Holy Book does not tell us the sun appeared suddenly as if by magic, and that he was not displeased to think, as all logic, natural and divine, demanded, that God had created the sun, causing it to proceed in the sky, through the first hours, like an unignited star, that would bit by bit come alight like green wood touched by the first spark from a flint. The wood at first barely smolders and then, as the puffing encourages it, it begins to crackle and finally agrees to a lively, blazing fire. Was it not beautiful to imagine the Father of the universe blowing on that still green ball, urging it to celebrate its victory 12 hours after the birth of time, right here on the antipodal meridian where they stood at this moment? They still had to define what the prime meridian was. And Father Casper admitted that the Isla de Hierro was still the best candidate, as Roberto had already learned this from Dr. Bird. There the compass needle makes no deviation, and the meridian line passes through the point very close to the pole where the Iron Mountains are at their highest. Surely a sign of stability. So then, to sum up, if we agree that Father Casper had set out from that meridian and moreover found the correct longitude, we still have to admit that while carefully tracing the course as navigator, he had failed as a geographer. The Daphne was not at our Solomon Islands but somewhere west of the New Hebrides, and that was that. However, I must reluctantly tell a story that, as we shall see, has to take place on the 180th meridian. Otherwise it loses all its flavor, while I accept that on the contrary it actually takes place God only knows how many degrees away, in one direction or the other. I will venture, then, a hypothesis that I defy any reader to challenge. Father Casper had erred to such an extent that he found himself, unwittingly, on our 180th meridian. I mean the one we calculate from Greenwich, the last place on earth he would have thought of, because it lay in the country of schismatic antipapists. In which case the Daphne would be at the Fiji Islands, where the natives are, in fact, very dark-skinned, at the very spot where today our 180th meridian passes, namely, at the island of Tabayuni. It works, more or less. The outline of Tabayuni shows a volcanic chain like the large island Roberto saw to his west. Except that Father Casper had told Roberto that the fatal meridian passed just in front of the bay of his island. Now, if we find ourselves with the meridian to the east, we see Tabayuni to the east, not to the west, and if to the west we see an island apparently corresponding to Roberto's description, then we surely have to the east some smaller island. My choice would be Kamea. But then the meridian would pass behind anyone looking at the island of our story. The truth is that with the data Roberto gives us, it is not possible to determine where the Daphne fetched up. Furthermore, all those little islands are like the Japanese for the Europeans, and vice versa, they all look the same. But still I wanted to make a try. One day I would like to retrace Roberto's voyage, searching for signs of him. But my geography is one thing, and his history is another. Our sole consolation is that all these quibbles are absolutely insignificant from the point of view of our tentative romance. What Father Wanderdrossel says to Roberto is that there on the 180th meridian, which is the antipode of the Antipodes, and there on the 180th meridian we find not our Solomon Islands but his island of Solomon. What does it matter, finally, whether it is there or not? If nothing more, this will be the story of two men who believe they're there, not of two who are there. And if you would listen to stories, this is dogma among the more liberal, you must suspend disbelief. So, the Daphne was facing the 180th meridian, just to the Solomon Islands, and our island was, among the islands of Solomon, the most Solomonic, as my verdict is Solomonic, cutting through the problem once and for all. So, Roberto asked at the end of the explanation, do you truly believe you will find on that island all the riches of which Menaias spoke? Those are Lugan der Spanischen Monarchy. We are facing the greatest prodigium of all human and sacred history, which you still can nicht understand. In Paris you looked at the ladies and followed the ratio studio rum of the Epicureans instead of reflecting on the great miracles of this our universum, may the sanctissimum nomen of our Creator fiat semper praised. As it happened, the reasons Father Casper had set sail bore no resemblance to the larcenous designs of the various navigators of other countries. Everything stemmed from the monumental work that he was writing, a treatise destined to remain more perennial than bronze, on the Great Flood. A true man of the Church, he intended to prove that the Bible had not lied, but, also a man of science, he wanted to make the sacred text agree with the results of the research of his own time. And to this end he had collected fossils, explored the lands of the Orient to discover something on the peak of Mount Ararat, and made very careful calculations of the putative dimensions of the ark, such as to allow it to contain so many animals, and, mind you, 7 pairs of the clean ones, and at the same time to have the correct proportion between the exposed part and the submerged part so the ship would not sink under all that weight or be swamped by waves, which during the flood cannot have been negligible ripples. He made a sketch to show Roberto the cross-section of the ark, like an enormous square building of 6 stories, the birds at the top, to receive the sun's light, the mammals in pens that could house not only kittens but also elephants, and the reptiles in a kind of bilge, where the amphibians could also find living space in the water. No room for the giants, and so that species became extinct. Finally, Noah did not have the problem of fish, the only creatures that had nothing to fear from the flood. Still, studying the flood, Father Casper had come up against a physicus hydrodynamicus problem, apparently insoluble. God, the Bible tells us, causes rain to fall on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, and the waters rise above the land until they cover even the highest mountains. And indeed they are rested at 15 cubits above the highest of the mountains, and the waters cover the earth thus for 150 days. All well and good, but have you tried ever the rain to collect? It rains all one day, and you cover the little bottom of a barrel. And if it rains one whole week, you scarcely fill the barrel. So imagine then an ungeheuer region, so hard you cannot stay from the house in it, and all that rain pours on your poor head, a rain worse than the hurricane of your shipwreck. In 40 days ist das unmöglich, not possible, to fill all the earth above the highest mountains. You mean to say the Bible lied? Nein, certainly not, but I must demonstrate where God all that water found, for it is not possible he made it fall from the sky. That is not enough. So, dumb bin ich nicht, not stupid. Vader Casper has thought what no other human being before now had thought ever. In premies, he read well the Bible, which says, ja, that God opened all the cataracts of heaven, but also had erupt all the Quellen, the Fontes Abyssi Magnae, all the fountains of the gross abyss. Genesis 7:11. After the flood ended he has the fountains of the deep closed. Genesis 8:2. What are these fountains of the deep? What are they? They are the waters that in the deepest depths of the sea are found. God took not only the rain but also the waters of the deepest oceans and poured them on the earth. And he took them here because, if the highest mountains of the earth are around the first meridian, between Jerusalem and Isla de Hierro, certainly the marine abysses the most deep must be here, on the anti-meridian, for reasons of symmetry. Yes, but the waters of all the seas of the globe are not enough to cover the mountains, otherwise they would always be covered. And if God emptied the waters of the sea onto the earth, he would cover the earth but he would drain the sea, and the sea would become a great empty hole, and Noah fall into it with all of his ark. You say correct. And more. If God take all the water of terra incognita and poured that on terra cognita, without this water in this hemisphere the earth all change its centrum gravitatis and overturn everything, and perhaps leap into the sky like a ball which you give a kick to it. So then you try to think what you do if you were God. Roberto was caught up in the game. If I am God, he said, forgetting to use the subjunctive mood as the God of the Italians commands, I create new water. You yes, but God no. God can ex nihilo water create, but where to put it after the flood? Then God, from the beginning of time, had put aside a great reserve supply of water beneath the deep, hidden in the center of the earth, and he brought it out on that occasion, just for 40 days, as if it were spouting from the volcanoes. Surely this is what the Bible means when we read that he opened the fountains of the deep. You think? But from volcanoes comes fire. All the zentrum of the earth, the heart of Mundus Subterraneus, is a gross mass of fire. If in the zentrum is fire, there water cannot also be. If water would be there, volcanoes would be fountains, he concluded. Roberto refused to give up. Then, if I am God, I take the water from another world, since worlds are infinite, and I pour it on the earth. You have in Paris heard those atheists who have infinite worlds talk. But God has only one world made, and that is enough for his glory. No, think better, if you do not infinite worlds have, and you have not time to make them specially for the flood and then throw them into the void again, what do you do? I honestly do not know. Because you have mens parva. I may, indeed. Yes, very parva. Now you think. If God could the water take that was yesterday on all the earth and pour it today, and tomorrow take all that was yesterday and it is already the double, and pour it day after tomorrow, and so on ad infinitum, perhaps comes the day when he all this sphere of ours can fill, to cover all the mountains, nicht? I am poor at sums, but I would say, at a certain point, yes. Ja. In 40 days he fills the earth with 40 times the water found in the seas, and if you make 40 times the depth of the seas, you surely cover the mountains. The deep is as much or far more deep than the mountains high are. But where did God find yesterday's water, when yesterday was already past? Why, here. Now listen. Think you are on the prime meridian. Can you imagine that? Yes, I can. Now think that here it is noon, and let us say noon on Holy Thursday. What time is it in Jerusalem? After all that I have learned about the course of the sun and about the meridians, I would say that in Jerusalem the sun would already have passed the meridian some time ago, so it would be late afternoon. I understand where you are leading me. Very well. At the prime meridian it is noon, on the 180th meridian it is midnight, for the sun passed already 12 hours before. Gut. Then here is midnight, thus end of Holy Thursday. What happens here immediately after? The first hour of Good Friday begins. And not on the prime meridian? No, over there it will still be the afternoon of that Thursday. Wunderbar. Therefore here it is already Friday and there it is still Thursday, no? But when there it has Friday become, here is already Saturday and the Lord is resurrect here when they're still dead, nicht wahr? Yes, all right, but I don't understand. Now you will understand. Where here is midnight and 1 minute, a minuscule part of 1 minute, you say that here is already Friday. Yes, of course. But think if at the same moment you would not be here on the ship but on that island you see, east of the line of the meridian. Perhaps you say there it already Friday is? No, it is still Thursday. It is midnight less 1 minute, less 1 second, but Thursday. Gut. At the same moment here is Friday and there, Thursday. Certainly, and, a thought suddenly arrested Roberto. And that's not all. You make me realize that if at that same instant I were on the line of the meridian, it would be midnight on the dot, but if I looked to the west, I would see the midnight of Friday, and if I looked to the east, I would see the midnight of Thursday. Holy God, you do not say God, bit. Forgive me, Father, but this is something miraculous. So in the face of a miracle you do not the name of God in vain take. Say Hollywood, if you like. But the great miracle is that there is no miracle. All was foreseen ab initio. If the sun to circle the earth takes 24 hours, to west of the 180th meridian begins a new day, and east we have still the day before. Midnight of Friday here on the ship is midnight of Thursday on the island. You know what to the sailors of Magellan happened when they finished their voyage around the world, as Peter Martyr tells. They came back and thought it was a day earlier, and instead it was a day later, and they believed God had punished them by taking from them a day, because they had not every Friday holy fasting observed. On the contrary, it was very natural. They had traveled from east to west. If from America towards Asia you sail, you lose one day. If in the opposite direction you sail, you gain a day. This is why the Daphne followed the route of Asia, and your stupid ship the way of America. You are now a day younger than me. Is that not to laugh? But I would be a day younger only if I went to the island, Roberto said. This was my little jocus. But to me is no matter if you are younger or older. To me matters that at this point of the earth there is a line that on this side is the day after and on that side the day before. And not only at midnight but also at 7, at 10, every hour. God then took from this abysso the water of yesterday, that you see there, and emptied it on the world of today, and the next day the same, and so on. Sign miraculo, naturaliter. God had arranged nature like to a great horologium. It is as if a horologium does not show the 12 hours, but the 24. In this horologium moves the hand or arrow towards the 24, and to the right of the 24 it was yesterday, and to the left, today. But how could the earth of yesterday remain steady in the sky, if there was no more water in this hemisphere? Did it not lose its centrum gravitatis? You think with the humana conception of time. For as homines exists yesterday no more, and tomorrow not yet. Tempus Dei, quod dissiter avum, is very different. Roberto reasoned that if God removed the water of yesterday and placed it in today, the earth of yesterday might undergo a succusation thanks to that damned center of gravity, but to human beings this should not matter. In their yesterday the succusation had not taken place. It had happened instead in a yesterday of God, who clearly knew how to handle different times and different stories, as a narrator who writes several novels, all with the same characters, but making different things befall them from story to story. As if there had been a chanson de Roland in which Roland died under a pine, and another in which he became King of France at the death of Charles, using Ganelon's hide as a carpet. A thought which, as we shall see, was to accompany Roberto for a long while, convincing him not only that the worlds can be infinite in space but also parallel in time. But he did not want to speak of this with Father Casper, who already considered profoundly heretical the idea of many worlds, and there was no telling what the good Jesuit would have said of this idea of Roberto's. He therefore confined himself to asking what God did to shift all that water from yesterday to today. The eruption of underwater volcanoes, Naderlich. You conceive? They blow hot winds, and what happens when a pan of milk is heated? The milk swells, rises, overflows the pan, spreads over the stove. But at that time it was not milk, said boiling aqua. Gross catastrophe. And how did God take all that water away after the 40 days? If it did not rain anymore, there was sun et nunc aqua evaporated little by little. The Bible says 150 days it took. If you wash and dry your shirt in one day, you can dry the earth in 150. And besides, much water into enormous subterranean lakes flowed, which now lies within the surface and the central fire. You have almost convinced me, Roberto said, who cared less about how that water had been moved than about the fact of being so close to yesterday. But by arriving here, what have you demonstrated that you could not have demonstrated before through the light of reason? I leave the light of reason to the old theologia. Today scientia wants proof through experientia. And the experientia is that I am here. Then before I arrived here I took many soundings, and I know how deep the sea down here is. Father Casper abandoned his geo-astronomical explanation and launched into the description of the flood. He spoke now his erudite Latin, gesticulating as if to evoke the various phenomena, celestial and infernal, as he paced the deck. While he strode, the sky above the bay was clouding over, announcing a storm of the sort that arrives, all of a sudden, only in the sea of the tropics. Now, all the fountains of the deep and the cataracts of the sky having opened, what horrendum et formidandum spectaculum was offered to Noah and his family. People took refuge first on the roofs, but their houses were swept away by the currents that arrived from the Antipodes with the force of the divine wind which had raised and driven them. Men and women climbed into the trees, but these were uprooted like weeds. They could see still the crowns of the most ancient oaks, and they clung to them, but the winds shook them with such rage that none could maintain their grip. Now in the waters that covered valleys and mountains swollen corpses could be seen floating, on which the remaining birds tried to perch, terrified, as if on some ghastly nest. But soon they lost even this last refuge, and they also succumbed, exhausted, to the tempest, their wings limp. O horrenda justitiae divinae spectacula, Father Casper exulted, and this was nothing, he guaranteed, compared to what it will be given us to see on the day when Christ returns to judge the quick and the dead. And to the great din of nature responded the animals of the ark. The howls of the wind were echoed by the wolves. To the roar of thunder the lion made counterpoint. At the shudder of lightning bolts the elephants trumpeted. The dogs barked on hearing the voice of their dying kin. The sheep wept at the crying of the children. The crows cawed at the cawing of the rain on the roof of the ark. The cows lowed at the lowing of the waves. And all the creatures of earth and air with their calamitous whimpering or mewing took part in the mourning of the planet. But it was on that occasion, Father Casper assured Roberto, that Noah and his family rediscovered the language Adam had spoken in Eden, which his sons had forgotten after the fall, and which the descendants of Noah would almost all lose on the day of the great confusion of Babel, except the heirs of Gomer, who carried it into the forests of the north, where the German people faithfully preserved it. Only the German language, the obsessed Father Casper now shouted in his native tongue. Redet mit der Zunge, donnert mit dem Himmel, blitzet mit den schnellen Woken, or, as he inventively continued, mixing the harsh sounds of different idioms, only. German speaks the tongue of nature, blitzes with the clouds, brums with the stag, grunzes with the Schweine, Zeelides with the eel, Meus with the cats, Schnatters with the Gandern, Quackers with the dukes, Clucken with the hen, Clappers with the Schwan, Kraka with the Raffen, Schwers with the Herndin. And in the end he was hoarse from his babblizing, and Roberto was convinced that the true language of Adam, rediscovered with the flood, flourished only in the lands of the Holy Roman Emperor. Dripping sweat, the priest concluded his evocation. The sky, as if frightened by the consequences of every flood, had held back its storm, like a sneeze that seems almost ready to explode but then is restrained with a grunt. Chapter 22. The Orange Dove. In the days that followed it became clear that the Specula Melitensis could not be reached, because Father Wanderdrossel, like Roberto, was unable to swim. The longboat was still over there in the inlet, but it was as if it did not exist. Now that he had a strong young man at his disposal, Father Casper could have constructed a raft and made a big oar, but, as he had explained, all the tools and materials were on the island. Without an axe they could not chop down the masts or the yards, without hammers they could not unhinge the doors and nail them together. But Father Casper did not seem excessively troubled by his long isolation. Indeed, he rejoiced, as he could once again enjoy the use of his cabin, the deck, and some instruments of study and observation. Roberto still did not understand what Father Casper Wanderdrossel was. A sage? That, certainly, or at least a scholar, a man curious about both natural and divine science. An eccentric? To be sure. At one moment he let fall that this ship had been fitted out not at the expense of the society but with his private funds, or rather, the money of his brother, a rich merchant as mad as he was. On another occasion he confided, complaining, that some of his fellow Jesuits had stolen many fecundissime ideas, after pretending to reject them as mere scribbling. Which suggested that back in Rome those reverend fathers had not grieved at the departure of this sophistic character. Considering that he was sailing at his own expense and there was a good chance he might be lost along those perilous routes, they may have encouraged him in order to be rid of him. The company Roberto had kept in Provence and in Paris had been such as to make him skeptical of the assertions of physics and natural philosophy that he heard the old man now make. But as we have seen, Roberto absorbed knowledge to which he was exposed as if he were a sponge, and was not distressed at believing in contradictory truths. Perhaps it was not that he lacked a taste for system, his was a choice. In Paris the world had appeared to him a stage on which deceptions were depicted, for the spectator wanted to follow and admire a different story every evening, as if the usual things, even if miraculous, no longer enlightened anyone, and only the unusually uncertain or the certainly unusual were able still to stimulate. The ancients had affirmed that for any question a sole answer existed, whereas the great theatre of Paris offered him the spectacle of a question to which the most varied replies could be given. Roberto decided to concede only half of his spirit to the things he believed, or believed he believed, keeping the other half open in case the contrary was true. If such was the disposition of his mind, we can then understand why he was not motivated to deny even the least plausible of Father Casper's revelations. Of all the tales he had heard, the one told him by the Jesuit was surely the most uncommon. But why consider it false? I challenge anyone to find himself abandoned on a deserted ship, between sea and sky in a vast space, and not be ready to dream that in his great misfortune he at least has had the good fortune to stumble into the heart of time. Roberto could also amuse himself by offering many objections to those tales, but often he behaved like the disciples of Socrates, who seemed to implore their own defeat. Besides, how could he reject the knowledge of a now paternal figure who had suddenly removed him from the condition of stunned castaway to that of a passenger on a ship someone knew and controlled? Whether it was the authority of his cassock or his office as original lord of that marine castle, Father Casper represented to Roberto's eyes authority, and Roberto had learned enough of the ideas of his century to know that to authority you must bend, at least in appearance. If Roberto did begin to have doubts about his host, the latter immediately took him to explore the ship again and showed him instruments that had previously escaped his notice, allowing him to learn so many and such important things, that his trust was won. For example, the Jesuit showed him some fishing rods and nets. The Daphne was anchored in teeming waters, and it was not a good idea to consume the provisions on board when it was possible to have fresh fish. Wearing every day his smoked eyeglasses, Roberto quickly learned to cast the nets and lower the line, and with no great effort he captured creatures of such size that more than once he risked being pulled overboard by the power of their jaws as they snatched the bait. He laid them on deck, and Father Casper seemed to know the nature of each and even its name. Whether he then named them according to their nature or christened them at his own whim, Roberto could not say. While the fish in his hemisphere were gray or at most a bright silver, these appeared pale blue with cherry-colored fins. They had saffron beards or scarlet snouts. He caught an eel with 2 heads, one at either end of its body, but Father Casper showed him that, on the contrary, the second head was actually a tail so decorated by nature that, in flicking it, the animal could frighten its enemies also from behind. Roberto captured a fish with immaculate belly, inky stripes on its back, all the colors of the rainbow circling the eye, a goat-like muzzle, but Father Casper immediately made him throw it back into the sea, knowing, from other Jesuits' accounts, or his own experience as a voyager, or seaman's tales, that it was more poisonous than the mortal Boletus. Of another fish, yellow eyes, 2